The Arte della Guerra is the most difficult of Machiavelli's political works. Of course, there are some wonderful pages, invariably present in all the anthologies of the Florentine secretary, such as the famous final invective against the Italian princes. Yet, as a whole, the book has suffered from its high degree of technicality for at least 200 years now. Not only does Machiavelli speak of something that we know little about and that does not concern us anymore, classical and early 16th century military practices, but he urges us to follow him in a very minute discussions about the shape of weapons, the disposition of the army during the battle, the layout of the camp. And while readers of the Principe can often draw broader conclusions from Machiavelli's analysis of the political competition in Renaissance Italy, here any similar attempt fails instantly due to the numerous obstacles that the Arte della Guerra poses to the non-specialist readers. The main barrier to the understanding and appreciation of the Arte della Guerra is paradoxically what makes it so different from the classical and humanistic military theory, a willingness to discuss in depth the tiniest aspects of the war experience. Thus, when Machiavelli scholars use their word technicality, it always brings with it a negative connotation, technique being the negation of politics. According to this reading, after the return of the Medici to Florence, Machiavelli chose a more prudent subject in order to avoid irritating the de facto lords of the city. In other words, writing a military treatise, Machiavelli would have taken a voluntary step backward. But we can judge this choice in a very different way. I think it is time to give a more positive view on the new technicality of the Arte della Guerra, which implied a huge effort by Machiavelli to clarify, correct, and integrate the insights contained in the Principe and in the Discorsi. Compared to the detailed discussions of the Arte della Guerra, many of the arguments of the previous years look like declarations of principle. Conversely, in the Arte della Guerra, for the first time, every detail is finally subject to the merciless analysis. Even if in many fundamental ways we are following the path opened by the Principe and the Discorsi, the choice to focus only on military problems doesn't need to be considered a step backward. On the contrary, it should be appreciated as an attempt to reinforce one of the key points of Machiavelli's political project, the complete Romanization of the modern world. Two examples will suffice. In the 12th chapter of the Principe, Machiavelli attacks the mercenaries because they refuse to fight during the winter. However, the same attitude, which was perfectly normal and sensible for the Renaissance military practice, is accepted in the Arte della Guerra. More importantly, we have the question of the organization of the infantry. In the last chapter of the Principe, Machiavelli closes his exhortation dreaming of an ordine terzo, capable of winning against both the Swiss pikes and the Spanish swordmen. In the Arte della Guerra, this ordine terzo will disappear, leaving room for a simpler combination of the two types already described in the Principe. Of course, from the Principe and the Discorsi to the Arte della Guerra, the key questions have not changed. First of all, the prudent politician must recognize what really counts according to the method of evaluation of the actual strengths described in the 10th chapter of the Principe. But the answer has not changed either. The only certain foundations are the armi proprie, and this is why Machiavelli decides to improve his study of military techniques. To be a good politician, to be a good political thinker, politics is not enough. You have to become a military expert as well. This is Machiavelli's fundamental belief. From this point of view, Machiavelli's decision to greatly improve his military analysis resembles the young Karl Marx's choice to devote himself, a philosopher, to the study of economics, a necessary step as soon as he understood that otherwise his project to overturning Hegel's philosophy would be ineffectual. The Arte della Guerra is a technical work because anyone who says that the main political problem is to be able to fight in the open field must discuss even the slightest details if he hopes to prove the effectiveness of his theory. Probably the biggest innovation of the arte della guerra in the history of military theory is the extraordinary role given to the tactical dimension, namely troops deployment and maneuvers. But tactics, beyond etymology, means first of all a different operational scale, more attentive to the ways in which the smaller units react and how their ability to respond and coordinate affects the outcome of the battle. Perhaps Machiavelli's interest in the narrower dimension of combat is the greatest innovation of his military work, whether compared to the classical authorities or to their medieval and humanist imitators. In the Epitoma Rei Militaris by Vegetius, we find both the brain of the general and the arm of the soldiers, the molecular unit and the set. In the Stratagemmata by Frontinus, none of this, as its topic is the cunning of the general, who fools his enemies and anticipates their plans. Just a quick glance at Vegetius' work suffices to see the clear dualism of his approach. We are told how to choose the recruit, how to train him, to what weapons of offense and defense he must be provided, how to keep up his morale and ensure his discipline even in the most difficult moments. On the other side, the Epitoma teaches us the great breakthrough and encirclement maneuvers, or the stratagems that allow the general to reverse the fate of the battle. This connection between these two levels, however, remains very weak, headed by a general military discipline or a simple list of officers chosen to ensure, we are not told how, a connection between the commander and the individual soldier. Just read the chapter dedicated by Vegetius to the movements of the troops, or their humanistic version by Roberto Valturio, and we will immediately see that in their works there is no room for the middle grades. The discourse is kept at the level of the strategic direction of the entire army. With the exception of a few patterns, the cuneus, the caput porcinum, the serra, the globus, Vegetius has no interest in the movements of the single platoons. He looks to the army as a whole body, or at most as a set of three parts strictly joined, that is the center and the wings, following a conception of the army that remained in vogue throughout the Middle Ages. Littler military units simply don't exist. Not would any original contribution on this point come from the Italian 15th century military theoretician Valturio. It is in this space that Machiavelli builds his military theory. The scale is smaller, but the key problem is still the movement of the military body. Developing a very common metaphor to allude to the army, one could say that Machiavelli tries to offer his readers a full theory of the nervous system of his legion. Adapting a well-known formula of Michel Foucault, we might even suggest that in the Arte della Guerra, a sort of microphysics of the war appears, which is instead absent from the Principe and the Discorsi. In fact, a considerable part of the Arte della Guerra is dedicated to intermediate figures that must ensure the cohesion of the army. Quotation, because in armies there are two orders, because in armies two orders are to be followed. One is that which men in each battalion must do, and the other is that which the battalion must do when it is with others in an army. And those men who do the first one well easily observe the second, but without knowing that, one can never reach the discipline of the second. It is not a small task, but it is absolutely necessary that a military commander starts from here, because, another quotation, because a brave army isn't brave because its men are brave, but because it is well ordered. Indeed, according to Machiavelli, the ability to maneuver is much more important than individual courage and experience. As he writes, another quotation, the soldiers who do this well are experienced, and even before they have looked an enemy in the face, they can be called old soldiers. And on the contrary, those who do not know how to keep their positions, even if they have fought in 1,000 wars, would still need to be considered new soldiers. With the abundance of quotations, I intend to point out the importance of the topic in the Arte della Guerra. Machiavelli changes the scale of discussion, shifting from the general questions about the discipline of soldiers to their ability to perform movements, turns, bend to one side, or even to retreat without losing the battle position. Compared to Vegetius and Volturio, the intermediate officers, neglected until now, here assume a decisive role. Without training them and their officers, assumes Machiavelli, any attempt to maneuver the body of the army effectively will simply be in vain. Predicting, understanding, inventing new stratagems is completely useless if the army doesn't follow the general's instructions. But to have a perfect response to the impulse coming from the top, a long training period is necessary. Also, the extreme attention given to the role of the Capodieci, the Roman decurion, depends on the need to tightly connect the general and the single unit. In the Arte della Guerra, the decurion is nothing but the most experienced soldier who stands at the end of a 10-man line and, as a cornerstone, occupies the more exposed and therefore more difficult position in the line because no soldier protects the right side of his body. Needless to say, even in this case, we do not find anything like this in Vegetius. Even Machiavelli's constant insistence on the battle signals is a direct consequence of his unprecedented attention to tactics. In order that the army will not come apart, the signals must be unequivocal and soldiers trained to understand immediately. Any uncertainty, any delay can be fatal once the battle begins. So the advice to avoid misunderstandings are very frequent throughout the Arte della Guerra. The army needs much training. Trumpets and drums are to be preferred to all other musical instruments. Any unnecessary noise has to be avoided so as not to increase the confusion. Orders must always be unequivocal. The fourth and last aspect of Machiavelli's concentration on connection is far more striking: the use of numerous graphics to show where the man should stand depending on the needs of the moment, during the march, on the battlefield, in the camp. The visual aid is a direct effect of the evolution of Machiavelli's military theory toward technique from the Principe and the Discorsi to the Arte della Guerra. Graphics help the author to describe what is to be made with great precision, so that the army can take position on the battlefield exactly as the general imagines. But graphics are especially useful for not leaving anything to chance, according to the principle that even the most insignificant details are very important in war, di gran momento, as Machiavelli says. Machiavelli gets tactical, and in fact the plates of the Arte della Guerra show the position of units of about 500 men, including velites, which is not even very many if you consider that Machiavelli's whole army should count around 12,000 men organized in 2 legions. Let's look at some of these graphics. Okay, this is Machiavelli's manuscript, the first edition of the Arte della Guerra. These plates are very famous, so I choose only a couple of them to show you these images. Machiavelli's scholars haven't given these graphics the attention they deserve. Yet the question is legitimate. Since neither Vegetius or Frontinus nor any medieval and humanistic military theorist uses graphics like this, how did Machiavelli realize that diagrams could be so helpful in describing and understanding the disposition of the troops? The answer lies in one of the ancient military treatises included at the end of the collected edition where Machiavelli read Vegetius and Frontinus, the De Instruendis Acebus, written by the Greek Aelianus and published in Rome by Eucharius Silber in 1487 in Theodorus Gaza's Latin translation. In the Latin translation, the brief work by Aelianus takes just 30 of our pages, but it will eventually enjoy a great success during the 16th century and be a key reading for Maurice Nassau's military reform in the Netherlands. Aelianus moves from the belief that the secret of war lies in mathematics and aims to teach his readers how to display a phalanx of soldiers, but also how to pass from one figure to another according to the unpredictable needs of the battle. For Aelianus, the great theoretical weakness of authors who preceded him is the predictable result of their ignorance in mathematics. Soldiers must be arranged according to the power of 2, so that every line can always be divisible by 2, or so to double their phase or their ranks, according to the need of the hour. In fact, a by no means negligible part of the De Instruendis Acebus focuses precisely on the different ways in which man must not only take place, but also turn, that is, advance, go back, or slide to decide to fight a particular type of enemy on a given terrain. Compared to Vegetius and Frontinus, Aelianus leads us to a series of entirely different issues. The purely strategic level, that is, conduction of the battle or even the entire campaign, is here superseded by a shift to individual units. In only one case, a diagram of the Instruendis Acebus shows more than 200 men. From this point of view, the nickname of tactical, used to distinguish our Aelianus from the Greek historian Claudius Aelianus, seems particularly appropriate. Between the general and the soldier, there is a space to be filled, first at the theoretical level, otherwise the phalanx will collapse. In fact, the Greek army described by Aelianus takes its strength from its perfect organization. If a Roman legionnaire can survive outside the platoon because he is equipped with heavy armor and handles both sword and shield, the Macedonian pikemen are much more vulnerable when the formation collapses because their long sarissa, a 6-meter pike, is effective only in group. Indeed, precisely because the phalanx requires a rigid collective discipline, no detail can be left to chance. In the Arte della Guerra, Machiavelli still follows his dream of giving birth to a neo-Roman legion. This is why, more than solutions, Machiavelli seems to have taken from the De Instruendis Acebus a working method and a series of questions. Given the necessity of dealing with the new demands raised by Aelianus, Machiavelli applies them to his project in an original way. Some of his key ideas on tactics come directly from here, like the role of the Capodieci or the insistence on an unequivocal signals in the light of the new importance given now to the army's connection. But even when the Arte della Guerra differs from his Greek source, for instance with the shift from 16-man lines to 10, the model is still clearly recognizable in Machiavelli's work. Machiavelli's interest in Aelianus is not casual. On the contrary, we could say that the evolution of military technology and art at the beginning of the 16th century created a very favorable context for the rediscovery of the De Instruendis Acebus. The new techniques spread by the introduction of the Swiss square of pikes, at least from the 70s, of the 15th century, of course, required special discipline from the soldiers and could be interpreted as a revival of the ancient Macedonian techniques. All their strength was put into holding the formation and raising a sort of iron wall made of pikes against the enemy. All of a sudden, individual courage and energy in the fray lost their importance compared to the skill of managing the cohesion of the square, whatever happens. But to keep the formation even in the midst of the battle, a special training and a special agreement between the commanders and the soldiers are needed. The fortune of Aelianus' Macedonian phalanx in Renaissance military theory depends directly on the continental spreading of the Swiss model. Still convinced of the superiority of the Roman army, in the De Struendis Acebus, Machiavelli found all the same a lot of insights still useful for his project. The Machiavellian obsession for small units and for intermediate officers, his attention to an effective transmission of orders, and his insistence on the centrality of perfect coordination, all come from the Greek theorist. Above all, the absolute centrality accorded to tactics is at the same time the principal innovation of the arte della guerra and the greatest legacy left by Aelianus to the Florentine. Thanks to his unprecedented attention to the microphysics of the battle, Machiavelli is the first theorist is the first theorist in 16th century military doctrine. Machiavelli is the first theorist of one of the great shifts in 16th century military doctrine, namely the tendency to consider the army not as a single entity or as a combination of only three elements, the center and the two wings, but rather as an unstable mixture of a great number of battalions and brigades cooperating with each other but tactically independent. Curiously, 19th and early 20th century military historiography was especially harsh with the innovations that made the arte della guerra a real turning point in Western military theory. Take, for instance, the problem of the connections. No theorist insisted as much as Machiavelli on the importance of the curion, that is, of the capodieci. But the military historians accuse him of underestimating the fundamental role of the officers because they compare Machiavelli's new Roman legion with the late 16th and 17th century armies. From a teleological perspective that takes the professional troops of the Ancien Regime as the standard and the model, Machiavelli's organization seems to them still too medieval, and this makes them forget that the turning point is marked precisely by the arte della guerra. It is not impossible that the new Roman legion described by Machiavelli would have failed on the battlefield. Anyway, in the absence of an experiment that nobody conducted, we can only compare Machiavellian theory to other abstract speculations. As soon as we choose to do so, and start reading the Arte della Guerra along with Catone Sacco, Roberto Valturio, Francesco Patrizi da Siena, or Antonio Cornazzano, to mention only the most important predecessors, we realize that Machiavelli's work easily wins the humanistic theory in completeness of information, in passion for detail, in the ability to catch the hidden relationship that tie together the different fields of military doctrine, and, above all, in the wake of Aelianus, it shows a special attention to a purely tactical dimension, hitherto unknown to Renaissance military speculation. A work of theory, even conceived to influence the practice of the battle, can only be compared to other works of theory, at least as long as someone doesn't try to make it real. From this perspective, there is no doubt that the Arte della Guerra is no less innovative as a military treatise than the Principe or the Discorsi are as political ones. And the reactions of his contemporaries, among whom the admiration always goes hand in hand with astonishment and skepticism and sometimes turns into open mockery, sufficiently demonstrate the extent to which Machiavelli's pages ushered in new kinds of problems. Some did not like it. In a famous novella, for instance, Matteo Bandello mocks the distance between the Machiavellian theory and his absolute inability to put into practice when Giovanni dalle Bande Nere gave him the opportunity to dispose the actual troops in a real parade. It became clear, this is Bandello, it became clear that then how big the difference is between he who knows and never applied what he knows and he who, besides the knowledge, gets his hands dirty, as it is customary to say. For centuries, this anecdote, forever reworked in new forms, has served as the basis for building a strong anti-Machiavellian tradition that mocks abstract theoretical knowledge devoid of any real experience of the world. Things are perhaps more complicated. We know, for instance, that Bandello is rehancing an old literary topos that comes from the De Oratore by Cicero, where we can read the story of Hannibal ironizing against the peripatetic philosopher Phormio, who claimed to discuss the art of war in a purely academic way, and moreover, in his presence. Yet, the fact that Bandello chose Machiavelli as a target gives us an interesting clue all the same. If Machiavelli represents the ideal candidate to play the role of the military theorist par excellence, it isn't merely because he already had an extraordinary reputation as a military expert just a few years after his death. It was also due to the particular kind of suggestions offered by the Arte della Guerra, and mostly from the unprecedented attention to tactics. Bandello attacks Machiavelli not only for his general inclination to abstract speculation, but also because he is the first modern military thinker who believes it possible to provide an exact science of something that, until his time, theory had refused to take into account. That is the smaller dimension of the conflict. In other words, it is precisely Machiavelli's project to legislate abstractly and without any practical experience about the movement of individual platoons that looks a little bit ridiculous, exactly like projects to ambition often look. So, comic correction is used to punish the crazy presumption of the former Florentine secretary converted to mathematics by Aelianus. Of course, Bandello wouldn't be alone in this polemic. Many late 16th century opponents of Machiavelli, such as the French antiquarian Blaise de Vigenère, will eventually accuse him of having taken something as important as the art of war for the game of chess. At the same time, in the very same years, the diagrams and the drawings introduced by Machiavelli became a standard instrument of explanation for military theorists throughout Europe. You can see, this is Aelianus, for instance. This is a 16th century translation to Italian. Again, Aelianus. And here you have Della Valle. Again Della Valle, again Della Valle, and okay, this is a French treatise, end of 16th century, and British treatise. Okay. Bandello's short stories were first printed in 1556. It is most interesting that a couple of generations later, in a work of military theory, deeply influenced by the Arte della Guerra, I Paralleli Militari, by Francesco Patrizzi from Cress, we find an anecdote that seems to be a precise reply to Bandello's accusation. Here, in order to persuade the reader of the importance of military theory, Patrizzi claims twice to have seen the great architect Andrea Palladio, this is the quotation, ordering 500 infantrymen with great ease and repeating all Aelianus figures, and specifies that Palladio had no previous practices of warfare, except for his reading of Caesar, Aelianus, and the Byzantine Emperor Leo VI. The mirror effect of the two stories is too perfect to be coincidence. Of course, Patrizzi wasn't interested in defending the good name of Machiavelli, who at that point was already banned by the Index. At the same time, though, he wasn't willing to approve Bandello's mockery of modern military theory. And more than as a historical record, Patrizzi's testimony must be read as an attempt to counter a voice that could harm his plan for a military science by referring to a great figure like Palladio, at the moment not less famous than the author of the Principe and the Discorsi. Bandello's Machiavelli and Patrizio's Palladio obtain opposite results, but they share a common belief in the possibility of building a theory of the tactical dimension of combat, as much as they share the same model, which is Aelianus. Not a single modern commentary of the Arte della Guerra registered the name of the Greek author in the footnotes, but all the same, it wouldn't be possible to overemphasize the importance of the De Instruendis Acebus in Machiavelli's military thought. The decisive idea that switches from Aelianus to Machiavelli is in fact that military theory doesn't have to do only with weapons, grades, machines, drills, discipline, rewards and punishment, because the real core of the battle is located somewhere else. In other words, military theory has to deal primarily with the movements of the troops. Both for Machiavelli and Aelianus, tactics are just this. Of course, the tactical drive has wider consequences, and the Principe's readers could easily connect it to the numerous passages where Machiavelli explains that man's actions must be judged in their context, avoiding any abstract moral rule, the principle of necessitas. It is only in connection and movement that the different elements can show their virtue, or rather their flaws, not abstractly, not observed from afar. From this point of view, the indication has an even more general importance. On the level of scale, Machiavelli's political thought is more tactical than strategic. Of course, this doesn't mean that Machiavelli lacks the broader perspectives, or that greater political projects are absent from his work. On the contrary, if there is a theorist of big politics, this theorist is certainly him. Machiavelli's work deserves and merits to be described as tactical because of his extraordinary emphasis on the necessity of always establishing a connection between the general plan, the movement of the whole army, and the actions of the single components, the platoon or even the man. In politics, the primacy accorded to the problem of bonds and links will go together with the condemnation of the republics and principalities that have never been seen or known to be true. For Machiavelli, making something possible is precisely to find a way to tie together an ambitious project and its reluctant contingencies. So, one of the possible definitions of the much celebrated Machiavellian realism, and not the worst, could be precisely this: the ability to reconnect the brain to the arm, that is, to keep the body metaphor that Machiavelli so often uses, to put the more distant branches of the political and military body in motion through a complicated system of nerves. Thank you.
The project of revalorizing the technical aspects of the art of war and getting away from the sort of disdain that both military historians and also some other readers of Machiavelli have recently brought towards art of war. I do think, I have one comment and a question. The comment has to do with the 16th century reception. I wonder whether you're. I think you may be overstating the rejection that the book experienced in the 16th century, because in the 16th century the book was incredibly popular. It went to 21 editions in Italian alone. It was translated into French, into English, into German, into Latin. Mm-hmm. So I think it was actually later that the book started to cause opposition. My question has to do with the focus on tactics and on on movement. And I mean, I'm wondering whether there isn't more to be said about linking the kind of training that Machiavelli advocates also to a specifically political vision, where the training and the management of bodies and the orchestration is linked to a certain kind of like republican vision of order. And I'm thinking also of some of the metaphors that Machiavelli uses. He refers to a camp at one point in Art of War.
He refers to what?
He refers to the encampment in Art of War one time as a città mobile, right, a mobile city. And I'm wondering whether there isn't more to be done here with the specifically political dimensions of order and training.
Okay, thank you. Is it okay for you if I answer you in Italian? Okay, it is easier for me, of course. Sì, naturalmente hai ragione sull'enorme successo dell'arte della guerra nel Cinquecento. È un'opera stampatissima, plagiatissima, nel senso che viene spesso sostanzialmente riscritta in francese o in spagnolo senza far mai apparire il nome di Machiavelli. Uno degli effetti di questo successo di Machiavelli è che nello stesso tempo si sviluppa immediatamente un fortissimo antimachiavellismo militare, ed è interessante che, diciamo, almeno dagli anni 70 del Cinquecento la novella di Bandello diventa proprio lo strumento. Io ho trovato credo 20 o 30 autori che la ripetono fino alla fine del Settecento, poi ho smesso di cercarli, no? Però diventa un po' l'argomento con cui si può smontare tutto l'edificio machiavelliano. E quindi direi che le due cose vanno assieme, cioè l'antimachiavellismo militare è il risultato della forza straordinaria del machiavellismo e del successo straordinario del machiavellismo militare. Ecco. Tra l'altro nel Cinquecento Aeliano, che è un nome che non troviamo mai fino a Machiavelli, nel Cinquecento invece il nome di Aeliano diventa sempre più frequentemente evocato proprio dagli studiosi di teoria militare, che non dicono mai che Machiavelli dipende da Aeliano, ma per loro è scontato. Poi diciamo i commentatori otto-novecenteschi questa cosa l'hanno dimenticata, e questo è il motivo per cui Aeliano è assente da qualsiasi edizione commentata dell'arte della guerra. John Hale qualche anno fa aveva fatto alla fine degli anni '80 un bellissimo saggio proprio sulla tradizione di Aeliano nel Cinquecento, in qualche modo seguendo il periodo successivo però a Machiavelli. Secondo me è molto giusto quello che tu dici sul rapporto tra la riflessione militare e la riflessione politica dell'arte della guerra e in generale dell'opera machiavelliana. Mi piace anche che tu hai richiamato questa idea dell'accampamento come città mobile. Io credo che Machiavelli in questo fosse semplicemente un ottimo lettore dei testi classici. Lui sapeva per esempio che quando l'esercito ateniese si trovava lontano da Atene, l'esercito aveva la possibilità, essendo un esercito fatto di cittadini, aveva la possibilità di deliberare come se si fosse trovato nell'agora di Atene. Cioè la città, questa è una cosa che ripete costantemente tutto il pensiero politico classico, c'è una differenza tra la città intesa come le mura della città e un'altra città che sono, diciamo, l'urbs, tra l'urbs e la civitas. La civitas, che può avere poi anche il significato del luogo sostanzialmente, ma è la cittadinanza, sono i cittadini. Dove sono raccolti i cittadini, lì potremmo dire che è la città. Da questo punto di vista un autore come Machiavelli, che pensa probabilmente alla possibilità di, andando oltre quello che lui stesso ha fatto con la milizia, quindi reclutando dal contado, ma pensa alla possibilità di un esercito di veri e propri cittadini, può trovare particolarmente efficace una immagine come quella dell'accampamento come città mobile. Ecco, perché se un giorno l'accampamento fosse davvero fatto di soldati cittadini, lì sarebbe la città che può prendere anche le decisioni politiche nel momento in cui però sta combattendo una campagna militare per il proprio paese.